I've been dreading, and it is a chapter to dread. 2 Samuel 10 is not the dreaded chapter, it's the chapter that precedes it. And basically, 2 Samuel 10 is just another series of victories that King David and the nation of Israel have. And that chapter ends, 2 Samuel 10 verse 19 says, "All the kings who were servants to Hadazer saw that they were defeated by Israel, and they made peace with Israel and served them, so the Syrians were afraid to help the people of Ammon anymore." So now then we'll begin 2 Samuel 11. If you're not aware of this, this is where we begin with David and his adultery with Bathsheba, and it is a dark chapter in the life of King David. And it starts out, 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. "It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah." What's the last sentence? "But David remained at Jerusalem." Verse 2, "Then it happened one evening that David arose from the bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, 'Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliab, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?' Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, and she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to home." Verse 5 is the only thing we hear from Bathsheba in this chapter. She sends a message to him, and the woman conceived, so she sent and told David and said, "I am with child." So David then begins to try and cover things up. He said to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite, who's in the battle." And Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah had come to him, David, under the pretense of his bringing him here to get information, wanted to know how Joab was doing, how the people were doing, how the war prospered. And then he said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But what we're going to discover is Uriah is a noble man, a soldier's soldier, a man of character. He slept at the door of the king's house with the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. When David found out, he said, "Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And listen to what Uriah says. He said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, and my lord Joab and his servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." So David said, "Wait here today, and tomorrow I'll let you depart." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. David called him. He ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of the Lord and not go down to his house. Uriah has more character drunk than David does sober. And in the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by hand of Uriah. And the letter is going to tell him how he wants him to send him out into the battle and then draw back the other people so he'll be killed. Do you know what I noticed about this? David realizes that Uriah is of such character, whether he realizes it consciously or unconsciously, subconsciously. He sends him a letter that is a letter of his execution, and he sends it by Uriah because he trusts Uriah not to open it. And so we look down at verse 26. When the wife Uriah heard her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So what we have here is the anatomy of a sin and a murder. And I couldn't help but think of James 1, verses 14, 15. Actually, if you start at verse 13, it says, "When you're tempted, you're not tempted of God, because God cannot tempt, nor will he tempt anyone to evil." But here's what it says. "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when full grown, brings forth death. I've entitled this lesson, Tempted by the Fruit of Another. Tempted, but the truth was discovered. King David is probably about 50 years old at this time. He has been you couldn't ask for a more successful king and a more successful reign. He's achieved great accomplishments. He became an overnight national hero when, as a shepherd boy, he slayed Goliath the giant. He restored Israel to its greatness. He's a great military leader. He's a brave warrior. He's a poet, a composer, a musician extraordinary. He is a visionary, a strong, charismatic leader who is adored by his people, feared and respected by his enemies. David is a rock star. His ratings would have been through the roof. He was in good standing throughout the land and region. So when this happened, you can see what his thought process was. If this gets out, it can be a scandal. It can ruin my administration. It can bring down everything I've tried to do. And if the soldiers find out I've had an adulterous relationship with one of my own men while he's in battle, they'll never trust me again. I can't imagine what Joab thinks of it. So what he does is, he sets out to do something. I couldn't help but think of the verse that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10, where he says, "Let him who think he's standing take heed," which means pay attention, lest you fall. So I want you to remember this. If you're God's child, you cannot sin successfully. You cannot sin and get away with it. It'll find you out. So remember these truths about sin I've told you before. Sin will always take you further than you want to go. It'll always keep you longer than you want to stay, and it'll always cost you more than you want to pay. David will get restored in his relationship with the Lord, but I'm going to tell you right now, David at probably age 50, and he's going to die at 70, the last 20 years of his life are not going to be the last 20 years he wanted, but they're going to be the last 20 years that God gives him, because God is going to make him obedient. He will confess. We'll see that in next week's lesson, but in this lesson we're going to look at this process and observe this sin from its conception to its carrying out, to its cover-up. So every sin begins with a thought. That's why we're told to guard our heart, that's our mind, our will, and emotion, with all diligence, for out of it come all the issues of life. In AA, we call wrong thinking stinking thinking, that you knew immediately, I can't entertain this thought. I can't think about this. I have to replace it. And we know that Proverbs also tells us, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So desire is a powerful force. It's a powerful force that can create a lot of good, can inspire you, inspire others, or it can take you on a road to ruin. And God wants to give you the desires of your heart, but we have an enemy that wants to take you in another direction. So let's remember who we are. As children of God, people have been saved, we possess two natures. We have an old sinful nature, and we have a new nature when we're born again in the Spirit. So those of us who've been twice born, we have dual natures. And Paul tells us we have to reckon that our old nature has been crucified. But he very plainly tells us, like in Galatians 2:20, he'll say, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. He says, here's what I know. Every time I want to do good, evil is always present. So sometimes I don't do what I want to do, but I do what I don't want to do. So we have an old sinful nature. And your old sinful nature is in an alliance with the devil and the culture that wants to conform you. And I can tell you exactly how they operate. We see it clearly in the first sin. Here's what the enemy of your soul and your old nature wants to persuade you. They want to convince you that there isn't any risk, that there are no consequences. It's only pleasurable. The enemy will minimize the risk in order to increase your interest. Watch what he did with Eve. He took away her fear. You'll not surely die. So he decreased the risk, minimized the risk, and now then he tells her of what the benefit is. You'll be like God. It's the same old, money back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Buy this and you'll know nothing but good days from now on. So we have an old nature which wants to lead you into temptation and question God's goodness. We have a new nature, and here's what Paul writes in Galatians 5:17. The sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They're in conflict with each other, so that you do not do what you want. Go back to a story that goes back to when our kids were young. We always used to ask them after Sunday school, what did you learn in Sunday school today? As soon as we get in the car, Jenna would begin to ask them that. And where we're going to church at Woodland, in the back, right by the fence of another yard, was a black dog. I think he was like a police dog that would bark, 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 bark. And I remember the day that John, who you just heard a few weeks ago, he said, we learned we have two natures. He said, we have a good nature, which is like a white dog. We have a bad nature, it's like the black dog. I said, so what'd you figure out, John? He said, you have to feed the white dog and starve the black dog so he can whip him. I said, what happens if you starve the white dog and feed the black dog? He said, well, the black dog's going to whip the white dog. And I added this, what if you feed them both about the same? He said, they'll have quite a fight, won't they? They'll fight all the time. That's where we are. Temptation begins with a single thought. You can ignore that thought or you can entertain that thought. Because we have the Spirit of God in us, we are able to have the Spirit screen our thoughts, and he can either select them or delete them, admit them, or cultivate them. So what Paul tells us is we have weapons that are divine to the pulling down of strongholds. So you have to take every thought that casts itself against Christ into captivity. So let's turn to our story and see what happened. First of all, it tells us it's the spring of the year, a time when kings go to battle. But where did it tell us that he was? He was up on the roof. He had remained in Jerusalem, and it tells us it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Temptation is always attractive. You know how I think about songs of our time. A lot of our Afro-American groups grew up and their roots came from gospel music from church. And I think it's interesting some of the names they selected. Temptations, Drifters. Drifters had two songs that were hits. They were about locations. One of them was Under the Boardwalk. Do you know what the other one was? Up on the Roof. Listen to these words. I wonder if they weren't thinking about this. When this old world starts getting me down and people are just too much for me to face, I climb way up to the top of the stairs and all my cares just drift into space. On the roof is the only place I know where you just have to wish to make it so. Let's go up on the roof, Bathsheba. That's exactly what he did. He was feeding on that temptation. You know, when I got into AA, after a while there was a man that came along to me, Bill T., who was a salesman. He says, boy, you remind me of myself when I was your age. He says, if you want a sponsor, I will be your sponsor. And said, you can call me any time of day. Any time of day, I don't care what it is if you're tempted to drink. But said, if you've already taken a drink, don't call me. That's pretty way it works. Guess what? I have a sponsor, and you have a sponsor who has said, call me anytime you're tempted, 24 hours a day. But if you've already sinned, we're going to have a different conversation. And if you'll call him before, this won't happen. This is what happened to him. He was up on the roof. He was not where he should have been. David, after 20 years, he could almost run Israel, his army, the economy, on cruise control. And so there he was doing what he shouldn't be doing. He's up on the roof, he is idle, he is unaccountable, and he is alone. And this is a perfect target. He is to be idle is not wrong. Everybody needs to have some downtime from activity. But you don't need to have downtime from thinking. And you need to watch what you're thinking. You don't need to be idle, and that is have no purpose at all. In our culture, at least at my age, one of the highlights of your teen years was turning 16 and getting your driver's license. Oh boy, was that fun. And you get to go out in the family car. And what did we say when our parents were going out? Where are you going? Out. What are you going to do? Oh, nothing. When you go out and you're up to no good, don't be surprised when you find no good. Because all of a sudden you're going out, and this is where he is. He's up on the roof. He's idle. He is not thinking. He is not equipped. And he thinks, I'm just up here just relaxing. I just like to get away from people and just get up here and just take it easy. And so this is what we see. And what I want you to see is we can trace back where David's problems began. Because David had received clear instruction. If you go back to Deuteronomy 17, you don't have to turn there, but Deuteronomy 17, when God is giving Moses the law, he knows they're going to come in the future where they want a king. So he tells them 3 things a king should not do and 1 thing they should always do. And here's what he told them. He said, the king shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause his people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. He's just telling them something real easy to understand. He says, people are going to admire you, they're going to look at you, you're going to be an example, and people are going to imitate you. If they see that multiplying horses is important, then they're going to multiply horses. Second thing he told them was, you're not to multiply wives for himself, and he told them why? Lest it turn your heart away. At the telling of this story right now, David has 7 wives, and we don't know how many concubines. The other one was, neither shall he multiply silver and gold for himself, because these things will be distractions and distractors and keep him from having at the top of mind, seeking first the kingdom of God. So David kept principles 1 and 3, but he multiplied his wives and concubines. Bathsheba will become his 8th wife. Guess what this did? This opened David to sexual sin. Not only does sin take you further than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, cost you more than you want to pay, this is a principle of sin. It does not satisfy, it only increases the desire for more. This is where he stumbled. This is where the devil got a foothold. And when the devil gets a foothold, he will make havoc of your life. And what you can see as you look at our country and our culture in the last 50 years of where he has gotten footholds, and now then we see where they are. You've heard it before. 1939, release of Gone with the Wind, a wonderful story. Baptist preachers in Atlanta came to those producers and said, we are hoping you won't use the word damn. And they said, why? Well, because it just opens the door to more profanity. You know what they told them? That'll never happen. We know what's happened, don't we? Not only in movies, it's just out. You can hear it in the grocery store. You can hear it on an elevator. You can hear it going up the stairs. People just dropping bombs everywhere with all kinds of words that we would have never seen. But guess what? You have it sitting in your house on a TV, invited in, turned on, and just laying out all of this stuff. And this is what we see. You can see where they've taken abortion to. You can see where they've taken marriage to. And I'm not being political, I'm being scriptural as to what happens. Sin never satisfies. The more wives and concubines he had, the more he desired, and his heart was turned away. We also are told in that same section in Deuteronomy 17, those three things he's not to do, and one thing he's to do. He was to write down his own copy in his own hand, a copy of the law, and he was to meditate on it day and night, which would include this. So here he is, he's up on the roof, and he has got an idle mind. And you know what they say about an idle mind? It's the devil's workshop, and the devil is getting really busy. And what we see is he could have been contemplating the scripture. He could have brought out those scrolls that he had written 20 years ago and just been reviewing them and going over them like he was told to meditate on them day and night. He could have brought up a counselor, somebody that would make him accountable, and to say, let's just talk about the state of affairs, what's going on. So what we also see is David then, what happens when you have an idle mind is we were created in the image of God. And one of the things we have is we're creative. We have imagination where we can begin to let our mind think about things. Here's what Jesus said. David knew the 10 Commandments. He knew adultery was wrong. He knew coveting was wrong. He knew murder was wrong. And what started out was, Jesus said, you looked at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery already with her in your heart. He said, you've imagined it, and when you imagine it, that is the beginning of it. That is the beginning of it. The conception is now beginning to become something entertaining of doing this. Watch what he does next. He asked who the woman was. You know what I think? I think the servants knew David was a womanizer. I think they tried to protect him when they could. And that's why one of them said, when he said, who is this woman? He inquired about the woman. He wanted to gain information and knowledge about her. And they said, that's Bathsheba. She's married, King. This is her daddy. You know him. You know her husband, Uriah. In fact, you'll find out later on, her grandfather is one of his trusted counselors. Do I need to tell any of you grandfathers that have a granddaughter what you think of somebody that would misuse your granddaughter? Can we say shotgun? Absolutely. And you'll find that this counselor, her grandfather, will actually side with Absalom in taking King David down. And now you know why. And so he gains information about her. You see, God showed us from the beginning, let me tell you what you shouldn't do, and you take my word for it. Adam, you can eat from any tree in the garden, but don't eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you do, you'll die. I can't say it any plainer. It is harmful. It is terrible. It is going to cause you all kinds of trouble. Do not try to find out for yourself by experience. Take my word for it. We know how that turned out. Because the enemy comes in, he is called a deceiver, he's called a liar, he's called the tempter. So here we see this is all being laid out. It started in this idle mind, which has become the workshop of the devil, and all of a sudden, here it is. Now, I can't read in looking at the words in Hebrew that David took her by force. I don't know what her role in this was. I'm not sure, and I'm not going to try to go there. But what I know is David must have believed he could get away with this. He must have believed that the servants wouldn't say anything. He never counted on this encounter turning into an unwanted pregnancy where he begins to take action to cover it up, and it turns into the biggest mess. He was tempted by the fruit of another. Tempted, but the truth was discovered. So you're probably thinking, you may be thinking, well, this is a temptation to commit adultery. Adultery can be not just committed with another person, it can be another activity that takes a place in your heart where you share that place with that. I heard the story of a very well-known, prominent moral judge who kind of in his later years really got into the Word of God, and he was called on one day to give his testimony. And what he had to say absolutely brought complete silence to this auditorium where he was speaking. He said, I've been a judge for over 50 years, been married to this wonderful woman right out here for over 50 years. But he said, I'm here to tell you today that I shared for many of those years the love of a mistress. The audience couldn't believe it. Why in the world would he admit this? What in the world must his wife think? You can almost see the whole audience's face turn red. They're embarrassed for him. And they look at his wife, and she's just looking at him as peaceful as ever. And then he says, my mistress, my lover, I was a lover of the law. I loved my career. I loved my position. And I shared so much of my time that I should have shared with the Lord and with my wife, with my career. And so we see that can happen. And so verse 4 just gets to the actual act taking place. And the act, fortunately, is not given us any detail. He has sex with her, she becomes pregnant. There's a very interesting couple of verses in Proverbs 6. They're very interesting because they're written by Solomon. You know who Solomon is? He is the son of Bathsheba and David. Listen to what he wrote. Can a man take fire to his bosoms and his clothes not be burned? Can one walk on hot coals and his feet not be seared? So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife. Solomon's saying, you can't play with fire. You're going to get burned. So here comes the cover-up. You can see his thought process. This is a scandal. If it gets out, could ruin and undo all the good I've done. You can see him rationalizing. I'll just bring Uriah home. That'll take care of it. It'll cover this up. It's interesting how the Lord connects dots. He will. And he connects dots by asking questions. Remember when Adam and Eve sinned? They came into the garden. He came into the garden they were hiding from. He said, where are you? He didn't ask that question because he needed information. He asked that question because he wanted them to look at their situation. They were hiding. And they called out to him. Adam says, well, we heard your voice in the garden and said we were afraid because we're naked. And watch the questions he asks. He gets them to connect the dots to show them the consequences of what they've done. Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What have you done? What in the world were you thinking, Adam and Eve? What have you done? Ever had your mother or daddy say that's you when you did something stupid? What were you thinking? What in the world is going on? David, it ends up, and David thinks, I've finally solved the problem, but he hasn't. He has made it worse than ever. Now we'll get to next week, we'll get to how he is confronted, how he confesses, and how he's contrite. We'll also bring in Psalm 51. What's interesting is Nathan is the one that'll confront him. David will have 4 sons by Bathsheba. Guess what he names one of the sons? Nathan. So let's talk about temptation just for a minute here in closing. Temptation is always attractive. That's what makes it so dangerous. You notice she wasn't just beautiful, she was very beautiful. When someone sins, we know what has happened. They were tempted and they gave into the temptation. So we'll look at Jesus' temptation in the wilderness in Matthew 4. But before we go there, let me just make a couple of comments. We know when there's this type of temptation, sexual temptation, we're to run from it. We're to avoid it. It's just like when I was getting sober, the last thing I was going to do was go sit in a bar and drink a Coke and talk to my old buddies. I knew I had to avoid it. And if I couldn't avoid it, I'd just run from it. But what I discovered was, and this is the same with Jesus, it's the same with David. See, David was up in a high place. He was up on a high place, but he was also at a high point in his career. They just whipped everybody. In 20 years, he could look and he could show how their gross domestic product had grown, how they, all the things it had done, which he could count and just say, look at what we've accomplished. And so he's at a high place. And he thinks, I'm not in war, so he's walking out there without any armor on. But Paul tells us we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against spiritual wickedness that is in high places. He didn't have his mind right. He didn't have on the helmet of salvation. I'm going to tell you something. You walk outside without the helmet of salvation on you, you're not going to think like Jesus does. You're not going to think like saved people do. You forget to put on the belt of truth, you are vulnerable to lies. You don't put the breastplate of righteousness on, you have opened areas where you can receive a grievous wound. Don't have on your feet shod with the gospel of preparation of peace, you're not going to be able to stand. And when you don't have the sword and the shield, you are vulnerable to attack. You're just a waiting target. So here's what happened to David. He's in a high place. Jesus has just been anointed by the Spirit of God, baptized by John the Baptist. The dove came down. He and John heard the words of his Father. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. So he's been at a high place, and now he's been out for 40 days. Let me tell you what happened to me. When I got saved and I began to go to AA, one of the highlights of my life, and Jenna was there with me in an open meeting, I received a chip for 30 consecutive days of sobriety. I'd never had that in 14 years. Guess what? That week I went to Bowling Green, Kentucky. I came out of a call and I was tempted like crazy to have a drink. I had one verse memorized that I'll share with you in a minute because the Holy Spirit told me I needed this. And I was able to get out from it. When I came back, I was so frightened of what had happened to me that I realize now I asked myself 3 questions that I didn't realize I'd ask myself because I think it was the Spirit leading me. I said, what is the wise thing for me to do based on my past experience? I knew what the wise thing was to do, not to be alone, out on the road, out on the roof, unaccountable. So what was I to do in my present situation? Get a job, or I was home every night. And what did I want to do as far as my future plans? I wanted to stay sober, be a man of God, be a good husband, and a good father. I went to work for my father-in-law. Started out, I was just going to help on one thing. I stayed there for 3 years. And this is what we see. God does not tempt us. Our enemy is called the tempter. And what we're told, and this was the verse that saved my life, because it's the only verse I had memorized besides things like John 3:16. No, 1 Corinthians 10:13, no temptation has overtaken you. I like that word they use in the New King James Version. Such is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above that which you're able to bear, but will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. You see, Hebrews 2:18 tells us, for he himself has suffered and been tempted. He's able to aid those who've been tempted, just like my sponsor in AA. He says, let me tell you what to do. Let me tell you what not to do. He said, let me tell you what to do if you're tempted to take a drink. Take your car keys out and put them down, because you're going to lose your car if you drink. Take your driver's license, put it down, because you're going to lose it if you take a drink. Take a picture of your family and put it down, because you're going to lose it if you continue to drink. Take everything that you own virtually and put it right here and say, is this worth it? Is this worth it? Think about it. Think the right thoughts. So I like it because the word overtaken. You see, the devil in your old nature will want to take over, and you have to overcome. And Jesus shows us how to do it. The first temptation he had, he's been fasting for 40 days, and the devil comes and says, why don't you turn those stones into bread? You know you can do it. What is that temptation? That temptation is to satisfy your desires your own way. Satisfies your desires your own way. Remember what he said? Man does not live by bread alone, just by his physical needs, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You have to feed yourself spiritually. That's why Jesus, when the disciples had gone into town, he was with the Samaritan woman at the well. When they came back, he wasn't hungry. He said, I have bread to eat that you don't know about. It's the will of God. Second was to cast himself from the top of the temple and have the angels catch him. He said, boy, that'll kickstart your ministry. People will be following you in throngs. Here's the problem. When you do that, is to presume God will bail you out of your problem. He's not going to do that. You're going to pay for it. It's faulty logic. It's faulty logic that says, well, when I got saved, all my sins forgiven, past, present, and future. So the Lord knew I was going to commit this sin. He's already forgiven. You know what Paul would say to something like this? Yes, it is true. When sin abounds, grace abounds more. He said, but I don't want you thinking this. Why don't I sin more so grace can abound more? And here's exactly what he says. God forbid. Same thing Jesus said to the woman caught in adultery. Go and sin no more. Same thing he said to the man if it was a paralytic. Go and sin no more or something worse will happen. Third thing he did was he says, took him up and showed him all the kingdom, said, you fall down and worship me and I'll give you all this. And he simply said to them, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Whenever you sin, you have made a decision that there's something you want more than you want God. That there's something you'd rather do, even though God has told you you can't do it without consequences. Tempted by the fruit of another. Tempted, but the truth was discovered. The more I study the Bible, the more I see how Satan copies everything that God does in the opposite. Remember what Jesus said to the disciples when he called them? You know the story in Luke 5. They've been out on the fishing all night, caught nothing. They're actually on shore cleaning up their nets when Jesus comes and gets in the boat and teaches the people. He's just come from 40 days of being tempted. He says, push out to the deep and let down your nets. You remember we talked about how Peter just let down the net because he didn't think they'd catch any. Then he said, they caught so many, the nets were breaking, they filled both boats until they're almost a sink. So what he said, follow me and I'll make you fisher of men. He said, cast the net. Cast the nets. I've been reading about artificial intelligence, robotic technology, and where it's carrying us. And what I realized some time ago was in Genesis 11, when man began the Tower of Babel and they're all one language, God said, we'll have to scatter them because if they're of one mind and one language, there's no stopping them. We're there now. The Tower of Babel has been built. It is the internet. And guess what? That is the net that the enemy is casting into the deep to draw men in, the internet. And so it's interesting to me, and again, this is not political. I'm just showing you examples of what the enemy has done. Our daughter had trouble conceiving and went through in vitro twice, which is very expensive. She had a miscarriage the first time. And I remember what she said to me. She said, there are people who are aborting their babies when I'm trying so hard to have one. Guess what? That's expensive to get pregnant that way. You know what the average cost of an adoption is? $20,000. You know what it costs to get an abortion? Just a few $100s. And they'll give you payment terms. And in some places you can get someone else to pay for it. That's the enemy. And that's what we see. And so we have to discover the truth because the truth will set us free. And the truth is, when you see what people are talking about, what you're seeing is the Tower of Babel has been built. We're in one language now. It is amazing what's going on in different places. I'll tell you what's happening with the internet and with artificial intelligence. It will have, I don't know if there is anything in our past, in all the progress we made that can compare to what the internet and artificial intelligence, how it's going to change. I'll say this, it is bigger than electricity and the electric light. And it's all there. We have been in an age of discovery, but now what you're seeing is beginning to happen. We've now moved to the age of implementation. And they are estimating, we don't know how it will happen, but within 15 years, 40 to 50% of the jobs now, not just blue collar, but white collar, can be replaced by artificial intelligence. And so what you see is what you see in China. And what you're hearing now in the arena and in our culture calls for massive government intervention. Can you say this? One world government. The buds are on the tree. They're as clear as you can see. As it was in the days of Noah. How was it in the days of Noah? Men's mind were on evil 24/7, and those who are believers in God were a very minute minority. As it was in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, so would it be. And what we see is sexual sin on steroids. Unbelievable what people now are doing. And we've lost maybe our ability to be shocked. And yet it keeps coming at us. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word. And I don't want it to discourage us, Lord, except from discourage us from disobeying you. I want it to encourage us to obey you because that's what you want. You take no pleasure in the death of the wicked. You do not take any pleasure in those who are perishing. And what we need to know is we need to cast the nets deep so that we can be fishers of men, for never was there a time that was more important. And so, Lord, I just pray that for such a time as this, we'll recognize what is important and seek first your kingdom and your righteousness. And when we do, all the things we need will be added to us. Thank you for the one who made it so, the one who is our protector, the one who is our sponsor. In his name, the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.